Welcome to Pizza Quest. I'm Peter Reinhardt. Howard Brownstein is a nationally known certified turnaround and crisis management professional. We'll find out in a minute what that actually means. But first, let me say that Howard is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School and also has an MBA and JD degree from Harvard University. That is a Doctor of Jurisprudence, which I guess means the law. He sits on the bar of 3 states but doesn't practice law. Instead, he serves on the board of directors of numerous corporations, has written over 130 articles, books, and chapters, speaks at conferences and universities around the world, all in the service of turnaround and crisis management. Howard and I are childhood friends, and in regards to Pizza Quest and my never-ending search for the perfect pizza, he got me my job covering for him as a substitute delivery driver for Mama's Pizzeria, a place I have written about extensively and the makers of, in my mind and memory, the best Philly cheesesteaks in the world, and the place where my Pizza Quest began. Since then, a lot has happened in both of our lives, most notably his incredibly successful career turning businesses and lives around. While I lean in on pizza as a metaphor for the quest for self-discovery and a meaningful life, I think the concept of turnaround management is a powerful metaphor in itself for exactly the same thing. So, Howard, welcome to Pizza Quest.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, listen, let's talk about your work in the context of this metaphor of turnaround. We'll explore more about your journey in a minute, but let me start by just asking you this. If you've ever had a client who you were not able to turn around or save from his or her crisis.
So I like to say that I can turn around and save absolutely any company. Just give me enough money and enough time. Unfortunately, neither belong to me. And so it's really up to the people whose money is at stake. What do they want to do? Do they want to commit more resources to save the company or not? And people with money at stake, could be the owners, but they could be creditors. They could be lenders. It's just a question of what outcome is going to be most beneficial to everyone. One of the cases that I've written about that I did not save turned out to be the largest retail liquidation in history.
Really?
And it was a Chapter 22 in bankruptcy.
I've never even heard of that.
Well, that's because it doesn't exist. We have a lot of humor in the bankruptcy world, and that's an example. It means the company filed Chapter 11 twice.
Oh, got it. All right.
And the company was Montgomery Ward. And Montgomery Ward was a historical retailer. I mean, the first big retailer in America. When the pioneers went west, there were no stores out there yet. And so they ordered from the Montgomery Ward catalog. And unfortunately, after more than 100 years of existence, the company fell on hard times and filed bankruptcy under Chapter 11. And when it filed Chapter 11, it was sold to GE Capital, which is a big capital company. And they bought it because Montgomery Ward had a big store credit card business, and GE Capital was interested in that. Unfortunately, they were unable to save the company, and it continued to deteriorate. And so when it filed Chapter 11 again, it looked like the creditors, the vendors who had sold things to Montgomery Ward, weren't going to recover hardly anything at all. And so they sued GE Capital for breach of fiduciary duty. Now, normally, when you hear that, it means the shareholders are suing the board members or the majority owners. But in this case, if a company's equity has evaporated, then the fiduciary duty of the board members and the majority owners is owed to the creditors. So there was this thermonuclear war going on over my head in courtroom while I was holding the assets. Eventually, the case settled, and we liquidated their assets which included assets in dozens of states because it was a national company.
Yeah.
It was the largest retail liquidation in history. So there's an example of one I didn't turn around.
So did any of the creditors, did they ever get their money?
Well, when you say their money,
Yeah.
they didn't get anywhere near everything they were owed. They got something.
And doesn't like filing Chapter 11 protect you from being sued?
Well, once you file Chapter 11, the debtor company can't be sued anymore. But in this case, the lawsuit was against GE Capital
Ah, yeah, yeah.
and the members of the board individually for breach of their putative fiduciary duty owed to the creditors.
So board members can the creditors can go after board members and directly for money. Is that what you're saying?
Only when the company is in what we call the zone of insolvency.
Mhm.
In the zone of insolvency, the equity, the shareholders no longer have any interest because the company's insolvent.
Uh,
And so then the duty shifts to the creditors. And that's when they can sue the
wow.
board.
It can get pretty, it sounds really complicated. And in this case, you're dealing with a huge corporation, which to us, the lay people that are kind of watching this story in the newspaper or whatever, is they're nameless, faceless people. But a
Well,
lot of the people that you deal with, and in my conversations with you over the years, you deal with people, with families, with sometimes heartbreaking stories of companies that maybe third generation that somehow got screwed up by bad management or this or that, and they ask you to come in and rescue us. It's kind of like you're the like the guy on TV rescue 911 or something. um what's that like, and how do you do that? How do you actually go in and figure out and untie the knots that are causing these companies to fail, and how do you deal with the human dramas, because I'm guessing a lot of these clients are not easy to deal with.
yeah, I mean, you're seeing otherwise good people at their worst. And you have to avoid getting distracted by things that are not central to the problem. You asked about cases where we didn't save the company.
Yeah.
And sometimes we'll go in, we'll analyze things, we'll come up with a plan, and we'll write this blindingly brilliant turnaround plan. And the owners look at it and say, you know what? We had a good run. We don't want to put any chips back on the table. Let's sell it.
Mm.
And then we'll sell the company using the turnaround plan to show what it could be. And there's plenty of money out there, private equity firms and others. They all have too much money and can't find enough deals. And so they're willing to look and see whether it's something they want to take a chance on. And then it's a matter of negotiating a price to see how much money we can get for the stakeholders, which start with the bank and the creditors, but there might be money for the owners. You said what it's like dealing with the people. I mean, you have to, as I like to say, focus on the donut, not the hole. It's easy to get distracted among all the things that are bothering people they're upset about. But many years ago, I was in the Air Force, and I was originally trained as a medical corpsman before I became an officer. And you learn triage. If a patient presents with a sprained ankle and personality problems, and oh yeah, they're bleeding from the neck,
Yeah.
you better treat the bleeding, or the other things aren't going to matter.
Yeah. Save the
So
baby. Yeah.
yeah, so you triage, and that for businesses normally means focusing on cash. If they run out of cash, they're not going to be able to pay rent. They're not going to be able to meet payroll. Even if they have value, if the value isn't liquid, then you can't use it. So you've got to come up with a solution that takes all of that into account.
So this whole concept of turnaround, and you want to get back to that sort of idea of the turnaround in the big picture, not only what it is literally, but sort of what it can represent, is a relatively new concept. I mean, if I understand from the things that you've sent me about the history of it, it kind of started in the 70s, in the 1970s. It didn't previously
No,
exist. It wasn't being taught in colleges. You didn't study it at Penn or at Harvard, right?
no, and it was actually later than that. It started in the late 80s, early 90s. What and the overarching force in all of this are banks. Banks are very heavily regulated, and there's a whole mentality at banks, and I know them well from dealing with them for 30 plus years. Plus, I've served on the board of a bank and I've served on the board of a finance company. And their mentality is really unique among businesses. If if you get audited by the IRS and you think that the auditor was unfair to you, you can challenge the audit on a line item basis and leave alone the things you got away with or that you can live with. But when a bank gets examined by the bank regulators and regulators require the bank to make changes, take reserves on certain loans, etc., they can only challenge it globally, which never happens. So as a result, they will tend to mark things down, take reserves in advance of the regulators at greater amounts than they're probably going to be required to show the regulator they got religion. I call that regulatory arbitrage. And as a result, they're the ones driving the process. So they have a company that's in default. And back in the late 80s, beginning early 90s, their only solution, other than to lend or not lend or enforce their rights and remedies under the lending agreement, would be to send in these accounting-oriented specialists to figure things out. The trouble is that, one, they were only accounting-oriented, not operationally oriented. And number two, they cannot tell the company what to do. They can only lend or not lend. If they start giving advice to the company and the company takes it and it doesn't work out, the company and the creditors can sue the bank for lender liability. So when bankers go to baby banker school and learn how to be bankers, they're told, do not tell companies, your borrowers, how to run their businesses. The
Interesting.
most you can do is tell them to get help. And that's what started happening in the early 90s. Banks realized they needed more than these accounting folks that worked for the bank. They were limited in what they could do or say. So they started insisting that the borrower hire its own help. They might give them a list of companies, but hire anyone reasonable. And so there emerged a new profession called turnaround management. And that's the time frame, late 80s, early 90s.
So were you in on that from like the beginning of the emergence of that?
I was.
Yeah.
I was. There arose an organization called the Turnaround Management Association, which was the professional organization of people who did this work. When they created a certification program in the early 90s, I was among the first that did it. And it's now a big and well-recognized profession, and there are some very big firms involved in it.
So you essentially you helped create, you and others who were in the early years, create this approach to saving businesses.
Well, yeah, I helped in the early days of development. I mean, it came into existence and I heard about it and got involved, but it was relatively new and it has evolved a lot. And, today it's well recognized, and banks routinely will hand a borrower a list of 3 to 5 companies and say, get help or else.
So, but and as usual, it always comes down to money then, because back in the end, it's if you don't have the money to pull off the turnaround, you got to get the money, and the banks aren't going to give you the money if you're not showing good faith and trying to do the right thing.
Right. So if you need more money, there may be non-bank lenders out there, finance companies that will lend. There may be investors who are willing to invest in a distressed deal and put money in that way. If it's owner operated, the owner may have some personal funds that they're willing to commit. But it just depends on the situation.
When you were in school. I mean, you had an interesting academic path in that you started out at a business college at Penn, and then ended up doing graduate work at Harvard, both in business. You got an MBA, but also a legal degree, a jurisprudence degree. How did you see any of this, and how did you see these choices that you were making?
Well, so it really evolved a little differently. So first of all, at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania has Quaker traditions, and that means we have rules and we have requirements, but we're focusing on the individual. And so if you have another way, you want to meet the rules and requirements, and you're not just trying to make it easier, we will listen. We may not do it, but we'll give you a fair listen. So I was able at University of Pennsylvania to get actually 2 degrees, one in business, one in history, and do 3 majors and do it all less than 3 years, just because they let me count this for that and that for this and gave me credit for something else. They were just open-minded.
Wow, and that's kind of nice. And so you designed a path for yourself.
Yeah, very much so. And as I say, at Penn, being a Quaker school, you can do that.
Huh.
And then I actually originally just went to law school, and I knew that, Harvard had a business school, but I never imagined going because I'd been to Wharton already. I had a business degree. But in the law school, you're organized into sections, and within your section, you have a study group. And my roommate, with whom I'm still friendly, had his study group would meet in our room, and one of his study group members was a guy whose father had been governor of Michigan, had been in Nixon's cabinet, and had been president of American Motors. And this classmate was Mitt Romney,
Ah,
who later became governor of Massachusetts and then a senator in Utah,
and a candidate for president.
which is which is very unique. To be
Yeah.
a high elected position in 2 different states is pretty rare. And Mitt was a great guy, and he was in this joint program with the law and the business school. And I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. So I went across the river to the business school, and they said, yeah, we'll take you. And so in my second year, instead of going to my second year of law school, I then did the first year of business school. And you do a 5-year program in 4 years when you do the joint JD MBA.
Somehow you found a way to compress time, both at Penn and at Harvard.
I have found at an early age, and I still do it today, read the rules, read the small print, learn what's behind the scene. There's frequently advantages that can be gained if you just take the time to do that.
We've talked about this in the past, and I think it's fascinating that so much of how you navigated both that Vietnam era when you had a high draft number and things like that, all, kind of came down to the fact that you read the rule book and you were able to kind of understand it and then take it back to the powers that be and say, listen, if I understand this correctly, I should be able to do this, this, and this. And they let you. Is that a fair assessment?
Exactly. You just, take the time to learn everything and find out what is not on the first page, but might be on page 12. And you may find that there are ways to do things. And you're right. I had a very low draft number, and I was getting ready to graduate college in 3 years. I was entitled to 4 years of deferment, but I'd worked so hard to get out early, but I would have been drafted 10 seconds after I graduated.
Yeah.
Because I had such a low draft number. I could have run away. A lot of people became conscientious objectors, or I could enlist. And because if you enlist, if you're drafted, you go in the Army and you're probably going to Vietnam.
Yeah.
If you enlist, there's a lot of options. There's the Navy, there's the Marines, there's the Air Force. You can enlist in the Army. And I found a recruiting sergeant in the Air Force who was willing to show me every training that he was recruiting for and the date you went away. And, I picked the one that seemed the most useful, which was medical corpsman, which I thought could come in handy someday. I'd actually wanted to be a doctor at one point in my life. I'd gotten accepted to a program at Penn State where you graduated high school in June. That July, you entered Penn State. And then 15 months later, you entered Jefferson Medical School.
Wow.
In 5 years total, you're an MD. And I was accepted. I had my $50 deposit paid, but my brother was in medical school and he never came out of his bedroom. And I thought, uh-oh, I don't know. So I opted not to go the medical route, but I'd always had an interest in it. So I became a medical corpsman in the Air Force. And the trouble was that my training wasn't due to release me until the first week in October. Meanwhile, I got into Harvard Law School. I called the dean and I said, hey, I'm in the service. I'm out early October. Can I show up then? He said, no, but we'll hold your place another year. And I thought, another year? God, I'm already 20.
Yeah.
So the way the medical corpsman training worked, 1 week, every week was a unit of training, and every Friday you could take an exam. If you passed it, you went on to the next week. If you failed it, you repeated the week. Well, they didn't want people to fail, so it wasn't all that hard. And so I found out that the commander of the school that I was learning in was a nurse. She was a major. I forget if she had some connection to Penn or Philadelphia. I don't know if I'm imagining that. But I went to see her. I did my fancy salute the way they taught us. And I said, Major, wouldn't it be great if we could show the Air Force how fast we could train medical corpsmen? Let me take the test when I'm ready. She said, terrific. We'll call it Operation Roadrunner. And so I actually plastered a comic book with the Roadrunner on it on my briefcase. And she assigned me a teacher. And I took the exams when I was ready. And I was done by the end of July.
In other words, you were able to accelerate taking the exam, so you didn't have to wait a whole week. Yeah.
Another example of reading the small print and inquiring. Got back to my unit. I said, hey, I want to get out before around Labor Day so I can go to law school. They said, great, if you'll volunteer. That's a bad word in the military.
Yeah.
If you'll volunteer for a month of temporary duty at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, which is where Air Force One stays. They need help in the hospital, we'll let you out Labor Day. So I went down to Washington, worked for a month in the hospital, came back and headed up to Harvard.
So basically, you didn't have to wait, and you were able to accelerate everything and then get in, before the doors shut.
Right, exactly. And so that, and then while at Harvard is where I started my board career. The bookstore at Harvard is a small department store. You can buy your books, but you can buy furniture, you can buy clothing, you can buy gifts.
Oh, yeah, the Harvard Coop, right?
Yeah, Coop means co-op.
The co-op, yeah.
It's a Harvard Cooperative Society, which means that if you're a student, for $1, you join. And if you're faculty or employee, you join for $1. And then at the end of the year, if they made a profit, they rebate money to everybody according to how much money you spent. And I heard that the board was faculty and students. So I stood outside the gym, collected signatures, got on the board, and oh my God, we had real problems. That rebate to members was vanishing, and we had to replace management. There was a nut on the board that was running to the Boston Globe telling them that the fur liners on the parkas we sold were an endangered species. Totally false. And I'm sitting next to a professor in the boardroom who taught corporate governance in the law school. And I never looked back. I've been working on boards ever since.
So that's another piece of your puzzle that you put together in your journey, is that in addition to doing turnaround management, you sit on a number of boards as almost like a parallel career to your work.
Exactly. And I've been doing it for 50 years.
And for those people who don't know, and because I didn't until I heard this from you, that this is something that you can get paid to do. You're a paid board member, but you also have liabilities. If you had been a board member of the
Enron,
yeah, or the place in Chicago that you were handling the litigation for, you could have been sued if you were a board member, right?
Now, board members, you have directors and officers liability insurance, but you've got to get it checked out. You got to make sure it stays in force. And yes, board members of privately owned or publicly traded companies are paid. Sometimes they're paid quite well. Board members of nonprofits are usually not paid, but that is slowly changing. And some of the biggest nonprofits are beginning to pay because it's been shown you get better engagement from the board members when you pay them, even if it's nominal.
A lot of nonprofit boards usually require that the board members pay them to be
Right.
or raise money for them.
They call that the give or get requirement, where you've got to either give a certain amount or help them raise it. The nonprofit boards that I serve on don't have that. I'm on one nonprofit board right now. We have 10,000 employees in about 12 states. It's a huge company. We don't want to pollute our governance by just putting big donors on the board who may have no interest or knowledge of governance. We need governance. So when I teach about this, I advise find another way to reward your donors. Call them trustees, put up statues of them, but make sure you get the governance you need.
So this is again, all these things kind of converge. You've got a lot of different threads going on in, from your life, from your educational background to the experiences you had even in the military. I mean, all these things played together. You didn't start out in turnaround management. You started out in a family business that then you just kept, using each of these stages to build an unfolding career. Could you talk a little bit about that and the navigation of your career?
Yeah. So, starting in the early 90s, I began doing turnaround management. And I was in the initial years a partner in, larger firms that did that had, several people in the firm that would deploy to help companies. And then beginning around 2009, I started my own company. And typically the turnaround team is not more than 1, 2, or 3 people. So we didn't need a lot of people. And I've had others in my firm to help me, but most of the time it's just me. And, we've seen some real situations over the years. I remember one was a mortgage company. And this was a successful mortgage company. They had several offices, and you would come in and they would take your application, charge you a fee, check your credit, order an appraisal. And then on the closing day of your home sale, the funds would be wired from what's called the warehouse line of credit to the closing table. And then when the quote unquote wet documents, the originals, come back from the closing, they would sell them to Fannie Mae or Citibank or somebody. And that was their business. And they were successful. And the owner's son took over, and he had an interesting idea. I don't know how much you know about credit unions, but they're very special financial institutions.
Uh-huh.
They don't have purely borrowers or depositors. They have members, and they're organized around an employer typically, and they're .orgs. They're nonprofits. And they rarely have a credit problem because everybody's employed. And he approaches these credit unions and says, hey, having a mortgage department for your members is difficult and expensive. You may need specially trained people. You may need a separate license in your state. You have to be able to sell mortgages to Fannie Mae, Citibank, and others. We will be your private label back office mortgage department. We will give great service to your members. He signs up about 125 credit unions, runs the company up to about $1 billion, but the margins are very small. When you close a mortgage as a lender, you only make about 1%. When you process a monthly payment as a mortgage lender, you only make about 0.25%. So every once in a while, he had too many mortgages closing that week and not enough funds. And he was bumping his head on the credit limit of that warehouse line of credit. So on those occasions, he would tap himself on the shoulder and name himself an assistant vice president of this or that credit union. He would then forge a document called an allonge that you use to sell a mortgage to Fannie Mae. And he would take mortgages that he was supposed to hold for the credit union and service for them and sell them to Fannie Mae. Now he'd been paid twice. We had plenty of money. He'd close the mortgages, and then he'd go to Fannie Mae, go, oh, look, the homeowner paid it off. Here's your money back. And this goes on for years, $1 million here, $1 million there. Nobody's really auditing them, least of all Fannie Mae. I heard a story that one time one of the managers from his accounting auditor firm got a little too close to the server he kept with the other set of books. And he called the partner in the auditing firm and said, hey, your guy is harassing the women. I want him out of here.
Oh,
Now, the owner thought that was pretty strange because he was pretty sure that guy was gay. But he couldn't do that. The partner in the firm couldn't say that. So he yanked him out of there. But then around 2008 or 9, this young owner decided what he really was a stock market genius. And he plunged into the market right in advance of the great crash.
oh boy.
And one day, in one of his branch offices, there was a manager who was getting accused of garden variety mortgage fraud, where he was going to fudge the application for an applicant so that it would get approved so that he'd make his fee. And he gets caught. And he goes, wait, I may have something bigger for you.
Yeah.
And so one day, a bunch of Ford Explorers pull up in front of the headquarters of this company with beefy guys and blue windbreakers and gold letters on the back. They storm the building, tell everybody, step away from your phones, don't touch your computers. People are sobbing. They think there's a bomb. Where's the guy? He got raided at home that morning and has already checked himself into rehab to start building a diminished mental capacity defense.
Oh boy.
I show up that afternoon and I'm greeted by a lawyer from a big law firm in New Jersey that I know. He introduces me to the guy that he shared an office with at the Department of Justice, who's still there, who introduces me to Special Agent so-and-so of the FBI. And over here, we have the Treasury Department Inspector General. Over here, we have Housing and Urban Development because it's Fannie Mae. And let's not forget our friends over here from, I forget what other department. And they look at me and go, who the hell are you? What's a chief restructuring officer, which was my role? And why don't we just put yellow tape around this building and indict the company? And I look at these guys like they're going to eat me for lunch. And I say, gentlemen, I'm not a government official. I would never presume to tell you your duty. What I do know, I've been here 1 hour. This company has about 1,000 mortgages committed to close in the next 60 or 90 days. Each one is a family somewhere in America with a deposit paid on a home. If this crashes and burns, they all default. And at that point, you guys are on the 6 o'clock national news, and not in a good way. Alternatively, you could stay in this room. Nothing leaves the building. Let me see if I can bring it down for a soft landing. So they let me do that. And we were able to move all the pending mortgages to other lenders. The credit unions are all freaked out because they never have a single problem. And now they got this mess. The guy pleads guilty to 12 and a half to 20. And I get a call from his lawyer. He wants to meet with me so that when he comes up for sentencing, they can truthfully say that he cooperated. Now, I've been sitting in his office at his desk. I pull out the drawers. His stuff is in the drawers. On the wall is a picture of his 17-year-old daughter jumping over a fence on a horse. And he's not going to see her second kid born. And she's not married. And I meet with this guy, and it's like looking into a coffin. And inevitably, I ask, all right, so how did all this begin? And like so many other cases I've been in, he says, one day he's in a situation. He put one toe over the line and looked up at heaven, and lightning didn't strike him. And then he does it again and again.
Yeah.
It becomes a way of life.
Yeah.
He ultimately got 14 years. He got out not that long ago. And that was one of my cases.
Wow. Boy, it's that all kind of is part of that. Pardon me. The Big Short. That sounds like that book and movie that was all about the kind of, I guess, was the trigger for the big crash.
It was one of the big cases, definitely. And so that's the world I live in. You hear all sorts of things. You go into a company that you've been referred to, and you're meeting with the owners and you say, "Oh, so how are you doing with your vendors with the trade?" And they go, "Okay, we're about 30 days late, but we know them all a long time and they're working with us." And they hand me the accounts payables aging report that they give the bank. And I look at it and it goes, "Yeah, it's about 30 days late. I see some concentration on here. You have some big vendors. Can I just see the detail?" They go, "Sure." And they hand me the ledgers for each of those vendors. Invoice payment, about 30 days late. I go, "Great. You know what? Can I just look at the bank statements for those months?" Oh, so unless you're mailing these checks to the planet Neptune, why are they taking 3.5 weeks to clear? Which drawer are you putting them in?
Uh-huh.
Because you don't have the cash to cover the check. But meanwhile, you've relieved payables on your accounting records as if you paid. And then you gave a knowingly false payables aging report to a regulated bank. Do I have that right? That's called bank fraud. So you've just had a heart attack, but fortunately, you've had it in the emergency room. I'm already here. So here's what we're going to do. And you are no longer signing checks. And you are now signing checks, but it takes two of you. And I'm informing the bank of all this. And if any of that is not all right with you, I'm leaving right now. And if they hear I left, they're going to have the cavalry here in the morning. So keep your eye on the donut, like not the hole, as I like to say. And we can get you out of this. They're going to report you for bank fraud. But if we pay them back in full, they're going to mail in their report. If we don't pay them back in full, they're going to go jump on some government official's desk. So let's follow up that way.
It can get pretty dramatic, it sounds like, and pretty, what's the word?
Well, I remain calm, but it can be dramatic for them.
Well, you've been doing it a long time now. And, again, bringing all these pieces together. But let me ask you this, going back to the beginning and looking back at sort of what's been driving you and motivating you. I was talking about Pizza Quest as sort of like, the pizza being the metaphor for my search for purpose and meaning. What would you say is driving you? What is it, if turnaround is in a sense the metaphor of who you are? Well, what is it that has driven you over all these years to be able to kind of connect the dots in creating a meaningful life?
Sure. I mean, I feel like I'm able to make a difference. I'm dealing with people that are in situations and it's not getting better. I pray for a company in trouble someday that makes good red Zinfandel wine, because then time will be my friend. The longer I take, the better it gets. I haven't had that one yet. So everything is under a pressure of urgency, and it's challenging and it's interesting. I get to use all my legal and business skills. I don't practice law. I don't give legal advice, but my knowledge of the law and how it works helps a lot.
It's kind of like reading the book before, reading the guidebook before you.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sometimes I'm in court and I've been called by my first name on the record by the judge about 12 times and nothing's going on. They're just very collegial. We all know each other. The bankruptcy community is extremely tight. All these bankruptcy judges were, were practicing lawyers before they went on the bench. So we all know each other. And, the idea is to get something done.
And what about your board work? How does that fit into this bigger
Well,
picture?
unsurprisingly, the board roles that find their way to me have something going on. They're not meet once a quarter, play golf, and have dinner. They're a mess. And I don't mind a mess because for me, a mess is another day at work.
It's opportunity.
Right. Yeah. So, I probably get the board opportunities that other people turn down. There's a process in public companies called shareholder activism. And what that is are these investors who buy into a company with the purpose of agitating for some change that they think is going to make the stock go up. The most famous activist is probably Carl Icahn. But when these activists get involved in the stock, it's frequently very disruptive because they're purposely very provocative. They're trying to attract attention of the press. and show off for their investors. And that can cause the company and the board to become very defensive and circle the wagons. And that's not healthy. So I've gone on boards where I was introduced by the activist and I convinced the company I was okay, or I was introduced by the company in response to the activist and convinced the activist that I was okay. And then I'll just work hard to bring the drama down, get something done. And as Harry Truman famously said, there's no limit to what you can achieve if you don't care who gets the credit. Because the activist is going to take credit for everything. Many roosters take credit for the dawn. And so, you can't get distracted by that. Just focus on the well-being of the company. So, I went on one board. An activist had already won 2 board seats and then substituted me for one of his people. And I knew when I went on the company's board, it was a little shaky. The company was a global distributor of metals, copper, aluminum, steel, all over the world. Had warehouses everywhere. And I knew they were a bit shaky. And sure enough, less than a year later, they came to the board. Okay, we're going to file Chapter 11 in about 60 days. We're keeping this under deep wraps until the day we file. And we're filing right here in Chicago. And I raised my hand and I said, no offense intended to the wonderful Seventh Circuit or the Northern District of Illinois. You want to file this case in Reno East, otherwise known as Wilmington, Delaware. And you want to put a road show together right now, go see all your vendors, tell them exactly what you're going to do, and show them graphically why it benefits them not to argue about anything. Walk into court arm in arm and file a prepackaged bankruptcy. You'll be out in 45 days. And they get all the credit. They did it. But
you get the advice. Yeah. That's pretty cool. There are people that may be listening to this conversation who have a lifetime of experience and they're going, hey, I never thought about possibly serving on other boards. You said that there was an association for turnaround specialists. What about for people who are interested in joining boards?
So there's a whole board community out there, and serving on boards is one of those paradoxical things that you can't do till you've done it, because the first thing they ask you is, have you ever been on a board?
Yeah.
So you want to get started. The easiest way is a nonprofit, because a board is a board. The laws are the same. The duties are identical. All that's different is how big is the nonprofit. If it just raises money, gives it away, has no employees or operations, okay, there's not much governance. As I mentioned, I'm on a huge nonprofit board, and I previously chaired the board of a United Way agency. So I'm familiar with all of that. The National Association of Corporate Directors website is nacdonline.org, has 25,000 members, chapters in major cities, great educational programs that lead to valuable credentials, many of which I teach, and I'm on their videos. To be a member of NACD, you have to be on a board, but a nonprofit board is sufficient. And you can go to, I think, 2 meetings without joining, just to check it out. There's another smaller organization called the Private Directors Association. As the name suggests, it's not public companies, just private companies. And I think it focuses a lot on family-owned businesses and the private equity community. And it's growing a lot. It has chapters now in most major cities and is getting bigger and bigger. Those are 2 of the good organizations.
Do these organizations provide training for people who to onboard them into the process itself of how to be a good, effective board member?
They have a lot of educational programs, and there's another one I do a monthly webinar for called Women in the Boardroom.
Whoa.
And they focus on improving board diversity, because it's been shown academically that companies with diverse boards perform better. Now, they're quick to say it may not be cause and effect. It's okay. We'll take it.
Yeah.
And so Women in the Boardroom provides one-on-one coaching for women executives and professionals that are seeking board roles. They also get a lot of inquiries from boards looking for people.
One final question, How some of the people, maybe most of the people who are listening to this are really interested in the pizza side. Maybe they're business operators, pizzeria operators, restaurant operators, or in business. Um, if they're finding themselves in situations where they're struggling, they're facing some crisis of some sort, what would you advise them? How would they find somebody to help them analyze and turn the situation around?
Well, if they have a bank, and particularly if the bank is part of the problem, giving them criticism or pressure, the bank likely can recommend local professionals who do what I do, whom the bank trusts, that might be able to help them. They can go to the Turnaround Management Association website, which is turnaround.org, and look up who's local that they could talk to. They could certainly ask their attorney, if they have a business attorney, who they could get in to help them. But those are just some of the ideas that they could pursue.
You told me at one time, because you visited my university down here, with the notion of possibly offering to do a course for them, because this the training for becoming turnaround specialists is not offered at universities, or hadn't been at that time. Is it happening now? Are there actual, courses being provided by colleges or other places for how to do what you do?
Not that widely, for some reason, it's just not considered sexy and attractive. And so there aren't that many business schools that are offering programs in turnaround management and restructuring. Some are, and law schools are teaching bankruptcy law and restructuring. There are some non-bankruptcy alternatives under the law. Um, but the business schools, by and large, haven't really signed on to teach turnaround management.
But let me get you out on this one. You talked about the how that you do what you do. Um, what would you say for you has been the most important takeaway in terms of the why you do what you do? What have you gotten out of your career that has given your life meaning and purpose?
Well, you get to make a difference. I mean, there's nothing wrong with working for a huge company, and like many people do, but it may be harder to measure what impact you've had. In what I do, I'm able to see firsthand the results of what I do, and that's very enjoyable, and I like that. It's interesting. Every day is different. You frequently have to pay attention to what is not obvious. You got to use your nose as well as your brain. Um, and you get to use a whole range of skills, including, calculating and things like that, but also, verbalizing and convincing and strategizing. It's a wide ranging set of skills you need.
If people want to follow up with you, or maybe watch maybe any kind of presentations you've made, do you have a presence on like YouTube or anything like that? Or
I don't have a presence on YouTube. I mean, my articles are generally available. And if anybody wants to reach out for me, we have a website, brownsteincorp.com.
there you go.
But I don't have a YouTube site, and I have not done a lot of live programs like this.
Yeah. Well, it's good that at least if anybody wants to follow up and get more information on either for your own need or for your interest in possibly pursuing similar course, or basically for me, one of the most exciting things, why I always love getting together with you and talking, is hearing the stories of how you connect the dots between the different life experiences that you have to open the way for the next step, whatever the next thing is, and to make something happen. I think one time you described yourself to me as somebody who can go into a chaotic situation and fix it and make it happen. You're a fixer. What can I say? You're a fixer. So, I find that to be totally fascinating, but also the amount of joy that you get from being able to, as you say, make a difference. I think if I had to say there was one driving term that, kind of explains why you do what you do, is because you like making a difference.
Yep, I do.
So thanks for that. And, I'll be continuing. I'll be seeing you soon. And when we get together, I'll try to catch up on any other new adventures that you've had since the last time that we got together. But I want to thank you for coming on Pizza Quest and sharing your story with our followers and listeners. And Howard Brownstein, thanks for being on Pizza Quest. And thank all of you who are listening and watching for joining us today. Join us next time for another episode of Pizza Quest. Thanks.